So let's go back to the 19th century again and pick up where we left off with wet plate collodion process, photographers using this wet plate system with albumin printing in the 1850s through about the 1880s. So we have this kind of cumbersome process. They're carrying glass plates into the field, they're coating them with wet emulsion. It's difficult to be there, especially when they're traveling into places that are remote and there's no civilization. They have to bring everything with them. But yet, we have these amazing photographs that are being produced, in this case by William Henry Jackson of Yellowstone in 1873. So we have these, really beautiful compositions with a gorgeous set of tonality from pure black to true white and many tones in between. And we have many compositions that were just very carefully and lovingly done. So here we have William Henry Jackson in Yellowstone in 1880 using a wet plate collodion negative process with his large format camera. Photographers were really rendering exquisite details and light qualities of the landscape at this time. And just the way that Jackson has placed the camera to create very carefully chosen compositions is not the work of somebody who's really just out there saying, let's get it done. Rather, it's the work of someone who really seems to care about this process. So we're seeing very masterful compositions here, even at this time, with this process, that are revealing a very dramatic beauty from the landscape. Interesting that there's a crack in this photograph too. If you look here, you'll see the crack that runs through here, and the photographer has chosen to save that broken negative and put the pieces together and make a print out of it anyhow. Here's another aspect of photography at the time, which is very different than landscape photography. So photography is very good at storytelling, of course, and here these photographs by Roger Fenton are telling a new story of war. So photography was going to begin to report the realities of the world, not just miraculous places in the world, but also how people interacted, both good and bad. To us, this doesn't look much like a war photograph that we're used to seeing, but it is the first war photograph that comes along with extensive documentation after photography's invention. This is the Crimean War. The Crimean War was major European powers versus the Russian Empire. This piece is called The Valley of the Shadow of Death. So this photograph doesn't make much sense until you see that these little spheres here are actually cannonballs. It was necessary to make photographs with no people in them because it took such a long time to make the exposures and also to make the wet plates. So the photographer really can't document the activity of the fighting or the motion, things that are actively going on. So they have to photograph either before or after the battle, but not during the battle. The US Civil War was probably the second major conflict to occur after the invention of photography. Certainly one of the first major conflicts to be comprehensively documented. And a name that comes up often for Civil War photography is Mathew Brady. So while American photographer Mathew Brady did make a number of Civil War photographs, he hired a large number of photographers to go out into the field and make photographs and then bring the negatives back to him. So Brady would then take their negatives, he would print them, he would stamp them as if they were photographed by Mathew Brady. They said Mathew Brady Studio, and he would sell them. So it turned out that most of the photographs that were well known are not actually his photographs, but actually made by some of the people that he hired. A side note to that is that William Henry Jackson, some of the pictures that I just previously showed you, worked for Mathew Brady. So photographs were made before and after the battle, but not during the battle, because of these long exposure times. Alexander Gardner, like other Civil War photographers, sometimes tried to communicate both pathos and patriotism in his photographs. Sometimes the best way to elevate one's cause is to create a story. So Gardner would create a scene, sometimes by posing bodies, dragging them to the places he wanted them to be, propping them up in ways that were more dramatic than in the way that they were found, and then he would craft a dramatic narrative to accompany the photograph. What's interesting here is that one of the things that occurred was that sometimes Gardner would not only pose the scene, but he would pose both sides of the conflict by using the same bodies. So this photograph is named The Home of the Rebel Sharpshooter, made in 1863. And here is a very similar image by Matthew Brady, or really, it was made by Alexander Gardner. Brady claimed Gardner's photography and published it as Sharpshooter's Last Sleep. This would be a Union soldier. The uniform is different than the original that I showed you. Gardner would have taken the uniform off of the dead Union soldier and put it onto this rebel soldier and moved the body to the right spot and photographed them however they felt was the most interesting. So this discovery was brought to light by historian William Prosinato, who published Gettysburg, a Journal in Time, in 1975. In 1975, Prosinato discovered that the same exact body was being called into play for both sides of the conflict. So battle photographs were made before and after the battle, but not during the battle, because of the process. Here's an image that was made around the same period of time as the Crimean War. It's a wonderful image made during the Civil War of a young boy manning the guns of a Civil War ship. The boy was a powder monkey whose job it was to go down below the ship and bring up gunpowder, and the photographer was able to make this portrait of this young man because he was holding still. So if this boy could hold still as he was and the camera was on a tripod and wouldn't move, we were able to get nice images like this of people during the war. During the Civil War, the camera was also used for scientific purposes, planning rehabilitation for those who had been maimed by war, and also documenting some of the atrocities of the war. In this case, here is a document of this man who has been starved, and here is a document of it. This is evidence of prisoners who were starved during the Civil War. So there's another impulse that's happening in photography at the same time that goes beyond this literal kind of documentation of landscape and war and people that we've been talking about here. So to go beyond the literal documentation of the place, person, or event, we have people who are using photography in different ways, like Julia Margaret Cameron. She's a good place to begin. She was an artist, and she was truly remarkable on a number of levels. One, because she was just a woman practicing photography in the 1860s and 70s, which was very unique. Most of the people making photography at this time who were documented were men. Also, for practicing photography at a level of greatness for her era. The kinds of images that she was making were quite popular, and she was distributing them and selling them and exhibiting them. Her contribution to the medium of photography was that a portrait didn't just have to be of someone's head and looking at someone in their face and documenting them as evidence of being there. But for her, it was very important to begin telling stories with her work. So remember, each of these exposures could be from a second or so up to several minutes long. She's using the wet plate collodion process. And a lot of her images tend to be very allegorical. She's hiring people to model for her, to wear costumes, and she's setting up scenes and building sets so that she can tell these allegorical stories. So Julia Margaret Cameron was depicting a lot of different English Arthurian themes from the times of King Arthur. She would dress people up and she would try to retell these kinds of stories in a photograph. So another part of Julia Margaret Cameron's story is that she was quite wealthy, and the people that she associated herself with were quite well-known people, and some were celebrities, which is one of the reasons that she became so well-known, is because she was photographing these people. But here she's photographing Sir John Herschel in 1867. Here's a wet plate collodion negative with albumen print. So Sir John Herschel was a friend of William Henry Fox Talbot. He was also a scientist who was known for his contributions to astronomy and also to photography. So here he's being photographed by Cameron, but he's an interesting person in the field of the science of photography. He came up with some very interesting terms in photography. One of them is fixer. In the darkroom, we use a chemical called fixer that fixes the process that makes the plates insensitive to the action of light. So he invented this process, and we still call it fixer today, and we still use the same chemical that he came up with. He also helped Fox Talbot to coin phrases to name some of the things that he was making, and one of the phrases that we use today is just negative. We're coming up with a wet plate negative. If we didn't call it negative, I don't know what we would call it, but he came up with that term, which has become very common. It also describes the tonally reversed image. Another great photograph by Cameron is this image of Charles Darwin. So another thing that was interesting about her was that she was a woman of some social standing, and because of that, she traveled in rather important circles and began to be able to photograph those people in those circles. And as I've mentioned, that was part of her claim to fame. So here she is again photographing Charles Darwin, who was a great scientist of his day. 1869, albumen print. Here's famous poet Alfred Lloyd Tennyson, who sat for one of Cameron's photographs to have a portrait made of him. And it was just 25 years after the daguerreotype process had become very popular. So you can see that her subjects are much less stiff than the earlier, more stern and rigid subjects in the daguerreotype photographs. She recognized that stiffness, and she was trying to work with that and create something better. Here I'd like to talk a little bit about another 19th century photographic innovation, perhaps equivalent to video gaming today or watching TV, this idea of using stereoscopic photography. Some of you probably have looked at this device when you were looking at the stereographs that you were viewing online, and hopefully some of you actually went to special collections and saw them for yourself. They're pretty unique. They really look like they're 3D images. To make a stereo image, you needed a stereo camera, and stereo cameras had lenses that were spaced at about the same distance as our human eyes, and that's kind of how it works. 2 photographs were made simultaneously on a single glass plate at one time, and they were separated slightly from each other about the same distance as your eyes. Both images were almost the same, but they were slightly different. They were later viewed in a viewer that allowed your 2 eyes to view each of them separately. Your brain can put the 2 images together to make one to recreate the illusion of 3 dimensions. So here's a process that does not use 1-point perspective. It really uses 2-point perspective. There are a lot of different types of pictures that appeal to the period interests of people, and in 3D no less, and including pornographic imagery, which was making a lot of money at the time, as it still continues to today. And now let's look at making photographs with no electricity. Here's an illustration of the photographer's studio from the 19th century. The better the studio, the more likely you were to be comfortable in that studio. So here's a very fancy camera. It's an 8x10 camera, I'm guessing. It looks like it's about that large. You can see skylight curtains that can add or subtract light from different parts of the scene. Up here on the ceiling and in the wall. Here is an actual photograph of one of those studios. You can see the devices that are helping hold them steady while they're making their exposures. So I'm going to jump yet again to a new topic, and this topic is wet plate derivatives. So it's the same collodion kind of sensitized material, but it wasn't just glass plate negatives that people were using it for. It also had a couple of other photographic types. So one of those types is called ambrotype. It's a direct positive image on glass, and another one is called tintype, a direct positive on metal. Both depended on underexposures and black background, but could be made faster and did not require a negative. So let's first take a look at the ambrotype. The ambrotype is an underexposed negative with black paper put behind it, or black velvet was placed behind it. And once the black paper was behind it, there was the illusion that it was a positive image because the light was reflecting off the surface of the silver that was sitting on the glass. So you can see that there's a black portion on the left half of the image, and it appears as if it is a positive on that side. It wasn't a very high quality image because it was such a weak exposure. It's kind of grayish if you didn't have the black paper behind it, and it didn't show a lot of detail in the shadows, but it was a positive image nonetheless. Even more popular than the ambrotype was to create something called a tintype. It was a piece of tin or really cheap metal that was painted black. It was allowed to dry. The wet plate collodion emulsion was coated over the top, and then a weak exposure was given over the surface of the metal. So intriguingly, this all comes out of the process of making negatives from which you could make multiple positives, the wet plate collodion process. But for some images, you didn't need to make multiple positives, you just needed one. So it cut the time in half by making the image rather than needing to have a long period of time between photographing a subject like this man and then developing the plate, letting the plate dry, making a print. And you got instead, with this process, a direct positive with one step. So this was also a faster process than the wet plate collodion negative albumin print positive process. It's also more affordable. Here's a hand-colored tintype of this young girl. And from the beginning of photography, people have noticed the absence of color. Obviously, these are all black and white images. They're monochromatic. So the photographers are beginning to use pigments, transparent paints that they can add. In this case, they're adding rosy cheeks to this girl. Here's an image of a blacksmith made in 1860, a beautiful tintype. Here's a tintype studio camera. Most of these cameras in studios were handmade, and all the apparatus was hand engineered, and it was made specifically for a particular photographer's studio. There were mass-produced cameras. There were cameras that were made in multiples, but I find that a lot of these old studios that I've visited actually have something that was crafted just for them.